Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 159th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross, and I thank you so much for joining us in our journey. As Levites and Judeans of the first century Roman Empire look back on their history from the exile, which is about 600 years, what impressions would help them to decide whether to accept or reject Jesus as the Messiah? So we're trying to get impressions more than logical, consequential history, okay? We go to our next screen. After being exiled from 586, that's the end of the 6th century, Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon in 539, just a little more than 40 years later, and freed the exiles to return home. Now Zerubbabel, the last king in David's bloodline, led a small group to restore Jerusalem. Not many wanted to go back to the pile of rubble. But Persia was not supportive of kingdom, so he had a very difficult time. Zerubbabel's attempts to rebuild the temple were sabotaged by Samaritans who felt rejected when their offers to help him were rejected. But they finally built a sad little temple by 516, and thus it remained till Ezra 60 years later, but it stopped being a kingly kingdom. Meanwhile, after they came back, after 516, the priest edited Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy and added Numbers and Leviticus. Thus was completed the Mosaic Law as we have it in today's Bible. Priests then rewrote 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings and named it Chronicles. It showed David more concerned with liturgy, psalms, Levites, and observance of Torah, not political concerns, but holy concerns. They cut out David's sin with Bathsheba and his deathbed order to kill all his enemies, his political enemies. Persians were more willing to support a priestly kingdom in Jerusalem. This paved the way for Ezra's return as high priest, for he was seed of Aaron and Zadok, David's high priest. You had to be in his Zadok's line. Ezra went to Jerusalem in 458 BC to remind the people that they were chosen by God to be a covenant people, pure and holy, and to rebuild Jerusalem. Thus Levites had to get rid of Goyim wives and children, for God's people had to have Jacob, Israel's flesh and blood. This was very hard on the Levites, and they really remembered this because they were supposed to be supportive of widows and orphans, and here they were doing the equivalent to their own wives and children, their own families. Solomon's Goyim wives caused him to lose control, they were reminded, and destroy Jerusalem. That's why it all happened. To zealously observe the law, the chosen needed calluses on their hearts. How do you throw out your wife and your children because they're not Jewish, they're not flesh and blood of Jacob? Jeremiah's teaching on love and circumcision of the heart seemed forgotten, and we'll come back to that in the next segment. Thus were the irreconcilable teachings of law. There were many irreconcilables, and we've been covering them. Now, Ezra is called the Moses of Judaism, for he determined Torah, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, and had it read out loud to all Jerusalem. In time, the high priest and Sadducees accepted only Torah as divinely inspired, and they left out the prophets. And right now, the prophets are not big because they're becoming a holy people. The emphasis is on individual families. We go on to the next screen. Nehemiah helped Ezra by rebuilding the city walls in 52 days in 445, allowing the city to grow. So Nehemiah seems to come out of nowhere, but now we find, where did he come from? Nehemiah was advisor to Persia's king Artaxerxes. When he heard of Jerusalem's sad state, he had the Persian king, Artaxerxes, assign him to Jerusalem. Like Joseph and Moses advised Pharaoh, education always empowered Israelis, like Nehemiah, to gain influential positions, and it worked in this case. Judea did well under Persians as priestly people. They wouldn't have done well as a kingdom. But the Greek culture was already invading Israel in the 4th century as it became the language of commerce, education, and theater, and wisdom literature. We go to our next screen, and we read many Levites at this time learned Greek to earn a living. They then taught Greek to Sadducean children, the richest children, who learned wisdom literature, the way of the wise, to prosper and control their lives, not to surrender to God's grace. Alexander the Great defeated Persia in 333 BC. He then founded Alexandria in Egypt. So not only was Greek culture invading the ancient world, but once Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, it was a Greek political society. His general Ptolemy brought 100,000 Judeans to Alexandria and had the Old Testament translated into Greek, called the Septuagint. We go on to the next screen. Judean life changed when the Seleucids in Syria in the 2nd century defeated the Ptolemies in Alexandria. Needing money, King Antiochus twice emptied the temple treasury in 168 BC, humiliating Judea. Now all the Judeans knew about this. Encouraged by Hellenized Jews, Antiochus IV forbids circumcision and temple sacrifice. An old priest in Modena, a small town outside Jerusalem, named Matthias, was outraged by Sadducean acceptance of Antiochus and his teachings, and their lack of legal observance. So he led a revolt which spread throughout the country. Matthias' family, called the Hasmoneans in history books, led the Maccabean Revolt, which succeeded because of zealous Jewish heroism. They were very brave, and the overwhelming problems of the Seleucid dynasty, which was more important. The Hasmoneans claimed the position of high priest despite not being seed of Zadok. Now it is very interesting. They revolted because they claimed they were zealous for God's law, but now they're breaking God's law in order to become high priest. When the Hasmoneans called in Pompey, a Roman general, in 63 to resolve a conflict over which brother was high illegal priest, I put the word illegal there, it deeply hurt zealous Jews as they saw Levite slaves deported and the temple severely damaged. So no matter how sincere you are and zealous you are, if you're greedy and you take advantage of the situation, you're not doing Israel any good. It worsened when Rome named Herod the Great king of Judah in 40 BC. He began building an enormous and impressive new temple and named the highest bidder high priest. So whoever gave him more money, he named high priest, as if it was indifferent. Sadducees accepted this repulsive situation as long as they shared in the temple prosperity, this huge building, everybody wanted to see it. The Pharisees, a new educated lay group, claimed that the Mosaic law included prophets and oral traditions they called the fence around the law. So they came out with a totally new outlook, hoping to correct what was wrong. And the Pharisees had contempt for Herod, the Sadducees, and the same contempt for the uneducated poor, called the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. We go on to our next screen. But even the Pharisees tolerated all of this as long as they shared in temple prosperity. The Pharisees' bigger view of law gave them more flexibility interpreting law, so despite their calloused hearts, they won the people's approval. The Zealots and the Essenes rejected unclean high priest, Herod's temple, and Rome. The Zealots were ruthless terrorists, just like today, rejected by all, but able by assassinations to cause Roman revenge, which allowed the Zealots to unite the calloused hearts of all parties in Jerusalem to revolt against Rome. So they manipulated and got their way, even though everybody knew how crazy they were. The Essenes were zealous observers who withdrew to the Jordan wilderness. They went back to the wilderness, an old theme. They rejected the illegal high priest and Herod's foul temple. Their shame of Israel inclined them to cleanliness and purity with many water washings. Now this is what's most important. John the Baptist was one in spirit, if not a member, so he hated the temple and the high priest. The Essenes reflected many Levites and Jews in the Roman Empire inclined to accept Jesus as Messiah, to circumcise their hearts and surrender control to the Father's saving grace and favor. I hope you were able to pick up a few impressions, even though it was overwhelming. And now as we come to our theme, you read it. Thank you so much for joining us for this 159th segment of our Journey of Faith in the Light of the Cross.